Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Tonight, we tell the story of a sultan trapped by the very soldiers sworn to protect him. For centuries, the Janissaries were the empire's sword, but they had become its poison, kingmakers and kingslayers who held the throne hostage. In the heart of Istanbul, Sultan Mahmud II faced a choice: submit to their tyranny and watch his empire crumble, or unleash an inferno to forge a new future from the ashes. This is the story of the auspicious incident, a single bloody night that would either save the Ottoman dynasty or drown it in blood. In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, a world of marble, gold, and silk, there existed a prison of exquisite cruelty. It was called the cafes, the cage. This was not a place of iron bars, but of opulent chambers, where the potential heirs to the Ottoman throne were kept in luxurious confinement. Here, Prince Mahmud lived not as royalty, but as a ghost, a potential threat to be neutralized by isolation. Born in 1785, his world was one of hushed whispers and the ever-present shadow of the executioner's silken cord. The cage was designed to prevent the fratricidal wars of succession that had so often bled the dynasty, but it created a new kind of poison, a deep, corrosive paranoia that seeped into the very soul of its inhabitants. Many princes went mad in the cafes, their minds broken by the silence and the waiting. But Mahmud was different. He was a survivor. He learned patience, the art of being invisible, of listening to the currents of power that flowed beyond his damask-draped walls. His only true window to the world was his cousin, the reigning Sultan, Selim III. Selim was a man possessed by a dangerous idea, that the ancient Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, could be healed. He saw the rot in its foundations, particularly in the Janissaries, the once elite soldiers who had become a corrupt, king-making Praetorian Guard. Selim would visit Mahmud in the cage, not as a jailer, but as a mentor. He spoke of a new army, the Nizam-i trained in the European style, and of a state remade by reason and efficiency. For the young prince, these were not mere political theories. They were whispers of life, of a future beyond the gilded bars of his prison. He listened, he learned, and he waited, nursing the seeds of a revolution planted in the suffocating silence of his confinement. The seeds of revolution planted by Sultan Selim III were destined to be watered with his own blood. His vision of a modern, disciplined army, the Nizam-i, was not seen as salvation by the old guard. It was seen as an existential threat. The Janissaries, a bloated and entitled military class, saw their privileged position, their power to dictate policy and even depose sultans, slipping away. They were the state's immune system, now attacking the very cure it needed. In 1807, the storm broke. Incited by conservative clerics who decried the sultan's infidel reforms, the Janissaries mutinied. They marched on the palace, their cauldrons overturned, the ancient signal of rebellion, their roars for the sultan's head echoing through the courtyards. Selim, a poet and composer at heart, was no ruthless tyrant. He hesitated. He tried to reason with the mob, underestimating the depth of their violent intransigence. He disbanded his new army, hoping to appease them, but it was a fatal miscalculation. Appeasement only fed their fury. They stormed the palace, deposed him, and dragged him from the throne he had tried to save. In his place, they installed Mahmud's half-brother, Mustafa IV, a weak and pliable ruler who would serve their interests. Selim was thrown back into the confines of the cafes, his dream of a renewed empire shattered. For Mahmud, watching from his own chambers, this was a terrifying, formative lesson. He saw how a noble vision could be destroyed by brute force, how the instruments of the state could turn on their master. The empire was not just sick, it was held hostage. And then came the final, brutal act. The following year, as forces loyal to Selim marched to restore him, his captors decided to eliminate the threat for good. Assassins entered his chambers. Selim fought back, a musician sultan fighting for his life, but he was overwhelmed and slain. His death was not just a political act, it was the murder of hope. His ghost would haunt the corridors of Topkapi, a constant bloody reminder to Mahmud of the price of reform and the cost of failure. With Selim III murdered and his corpse displayed to his would-be rescuers, the throne belonged to Mustafa IV. But it was a hollow crown. Mustafa was not a ruler, he was a placeholder, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the Janissary commanders and the reactionary clerics who had engineered the coup. He reigned in a climate of fear and triumphant ignorance, reversing all of Selim's modernizing edicts. The printing presses were silenced, the European-style uniforms burned, and the Nizam-i soldiers hunted down. The empire was deliberately being dragged back into a past that could no longer defend it. For Prince Mahmud, still locked away, this period was the most perilous of his life. He was the last remaining male of the House of Osman, besides the Sultan himself. His existence was a constant, silent threat to Mustafa's fragile authority. Every breath he took was at the whim of a paranoid brother and his powerful, violent handlers. He survived by making himself small, by feigning disinterest in the affairs of state, by mastering the art of invisibility he had perfected over a lifetime in the cage. But outside the suffocating walls of Constantinople, a storm was gathering. The man who had marched to save Selim, a powerful and loyal Balkan governor named Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, was not deterred by the Sultan's murder. His grief and fury now had a new purpose: vengeance and the restoration of Selim's vision. He saw Mustafa IV for what he was, an illegitimate usurper propped up by rebels. Alemdar gathered his army, a formidable force of provincial troops loyal to the cause of reform, and began his slow, deliberate march back to the capital. The news filtered into the palace, a drumbeat of approaching doom for the ruling faction. For Mahmud, it was a terrifying ray of hope. A war was coming to the gates of the palace, a war for the soul of the empire, and he was the prize, the pivot upon which its entire future would turn. His life now depended on a race between Alemdar's army and his brother's assassins. The storm broke on July 28, 1808. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha's army surrounded the Topkapi Palace. He demanded the surrender of Sultan Mustafa IV and the restoration of the rightful line. Panic erupted within the palace walls. The puppet sultan, cornered and terrified, made a final desperate move born of pure dynastic savagery. If he was to be deposed, he would ensure no one else could take his place. He gave the order that would echo in Ottoman history: execute both the imprisoned Selim and Prince Mahmud. He would be the last man of Osman's line left alive. As Alemdar's men breached the outer gates, assassins loyal to Mustafa IV raced through the labyrinthine corridors of the harem towards the prince's chambers. They had already murdered Selim, but now they came for Mahmud. What followed was a frantic, life-or-death struggle in the heart of the empire. Alerted by loyal servants, Mahmud fled. The assassins were seconds behind him. A brave concubine, Sevri Kalfa, reportedly threw a brazier of hot coals at the attackers, buying the prince precious moments to escape to the palace roof. He scrambled across the tiles, a future sultan fleeing for his life like a common thief, while below him, the fate of a 600-year-old dynasty was being decided by the sword. By the time Alemdar's soldiers fought their way into the inner sanctum, they found Mahmud. He was brought forth, the sole surviving heir, and acclaimed as Sultan Mahmud II. He ascended to the throne of his ancestors, not in a stately ceremony, but in the chaotic, blood-soaked aftermath of a palace siege. His predecessor and half-brother Mustafa was captured and would soon be executed. Mahmud was finally sultan, but his reign began in a court filled with whispers and ghosts. He was surrounded by the very power structures that had murdered his mentor and tried to end his own life. He owed his throne to a powerful pasha, yet he knew that to truly rule, he could depend on no one. This baptism of fire forged a new kind of ruler, patient, cunning, and utterly ruthless. His smile would hide a memory of assassins, and his hand would one day unleash a vengeance of unimaginable scale. Mahmud II ascends the throne in 1808. He is 23 years old. But this is no glorious coronation. It is a succession born of blood and terror. He is the last surviving male of the House of Osman, a lonely figure in a palace whose corridors still echo with the screams of his murdered cousin, the reformer Selim III, and the violent deposition of his own brother, Mustafa IV. He owes his life and his throne to a provincial warlord, Alamdar Mustafa Pasha, but this alliance is a fragile shield against the true power in the city, the Janissaries. They are the ones who murdered Selim for his attempts at reform. They are the ones who just days ago stormed the palace, demanding Mustafa's restoration. They are a tempest of steel and fury, and Mahmud is now in its eye. For years, he must play the part of a ghost. He is a sultan who dares not rule, a sovereign who cannot command. Every public appearance is a calculated performance of piety and tradition. He attends mosque. He consults the conservative ulama. He bestows gifts upon the Janissary commanders who despise him. He must appear weak, uninterested in the military affairs that cost his cousin his life. Inside, however, a cold resolve is hardening. He watches, he listens, he learns. He sees the empire decaying from within, its Balkan provinces erupting in nationalist revolts, its coffers drained by a military that consumes everything and produces only defeat. He is a prisoner in the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by spies, his every word reported back to the Janissary barracks. This period of forced inaction is not one of weakness, but of incubation. He is studying his enemy, mapping their strengths, their rituals, their arrogance. He is learning the bitter lesson that power in the Ottoman Empire is not inherited. It must be seized, brutally and decisively, from those who have stolen it. His reign begins not with a proclamation, but with a vow of silence, a patient, simmering promise of future vengeance. To understand Mahmud's predicament, one must understand the Janissaries. Not the legendary slave soldiers of Mehmed the Conqueror, but the bloated, corrupt institution they had become by the 19th century. They were a state within a state, a Praetorian Guard that had long forgotten its purpose. Their loyalty was not to the Sultan or the empire, but to their own cauldron, the symbol of their corps and their privileges. By Mahmud's time, the corps was no longer a meritocratic fighting force. It had become a hereditary caste, a social club for the urban rabble of Constantinople. Sons inherited their father's place on the payroll, yet many never saw a day of training or battle. They were shopkeepers, artisans, and gangsters who collected a soldier's wage while running protection rackets. Their numbers were massively inflated on paper, with commanders pocketing the pay of these ghost soldiers. Militarily, they were an anachronism, a liability. Clinging to their outdated muskets and yataghan swords, they vehemently rejected modern training and tactics, viewing them as a Frankish or infidel corruption. Any attempt to introduce discipline or new drills was met with violent mutiny. They saw reform not as a path to imperial survival, but as a direct threat to their lazy, privileged existence. They were kingmakers and kingbreakers, the ultimate arbiters of policy. If they disliked a grand vizier, they burned his mansion to the ground. If they opposed a sultan's decree, they would overturn their cauldrons in the hippodrome, the signal for revolt, sending terror through the streets of the capital. They had murdered Selim III. They had deposed Mustafa IV. They held the Sultanate hostage, a parasitic growth strangling the very empire they were sworn to protect. They were not soldiers. They were the masters of the empire, and they believed their power was absolute and eternal. Mahmud knew that for the empire to live, the Janissaries had to die. Mahmud II was a master of patience, a virtue forged in the crucible of fear during his long confinement in the palace. He had seen what happened to his cousin Selim III, who had rushed his reforms and announced his intentions to the world. Selim had been a visionary, but a naive one. Mahmud would be a pragmatist, a conspirator. His first 2 decades on the throne were a masterclass in political maneuvering, a slow, methodical game of chess played for the highest stakes. His first move was to survive. After the Janissaries swiftly murdered his protector, Alamdar Mustafa Pasha, Mahmud retreated into his shell, feigning submission. But in the shadows, he was working. His strategy was to isolate his great enemy. The Janissaries did not exist in a vacuum. Their power was propped up by a network of conservative clerics, and most importantly, the powerful, semi-independent provincial lords known as the Ayans. These lords commanded their own armies and ruled vast swathes of the empire like personal fiefdoms. Mahmud knew he could not fight the Janissaries and the Ayans at the same time. So, he began the long, arduous process of centralization. One by one, through a mixture of diplomacy, subterfuge, and military force, he brought the great provincial dynasties to heel. He broke the power of the Karamanawulara. He crushed the rebellion of Ali Pasha of Ioannina. Each victory brought more tax revenue, more territory, and more soldiers directly under his personal control, chipping away at the decentralized system that fed the empire's chaos. Simultaneously, he carefully cultivated a faction of reform-minded clerics and bureaucrats, men who understood that the empire's only path to survival was modernization. He was building a coalition, not just of soldiers, but of ideas. He was walking a tightrope over a chasm of rebellion, slowly and deliberately shifting the balance of power, waiting for the moment when his feet would be on solid ground, ready to turn and face the monster he had been placating for so long. While Mahmud played the long game of politics, he embarked on his most dangerous project in absolute secrecy. He knew that to destroy an army, you needed a better army. The Janissaries were a blunt, rusted instrument, but they were numerous and held the capital. A direct confrontation without a superior force was suicide. Thus, in the quiet corners of the empire, far from the suspicious eyes of the Janissary spies in Istanbul, a new military was being born. It began not as a single army, but as disconnected parts of the existing state machinery, carefully repurposed. Mahmud focused on the technical corps first, the artillerymen and the bombardiers. These units had a tradition of technical skill and were more receptive to European methods. He quietly brought in Prussian and French military advisors, not as official trainers to a new army, but as technical consultants to modernize the imperial cannon foundries and improve siegecraft. Under this guise, they began training Ottoman officers in modern tactics, ballistics, and command structures. The Sultan poured state funds into these corps, ensuring they had the best cannon, the most reliable gunpowder, and the highest pay. He promoted officers based on merit and, above all, loyalty to him personally. This new generation of artillery officer owed everything to Mahmud, not to the old Janissary system. Slowly, a modern, disciplined, and lethally effective artillery force was forged. This was Mahmud's trump card. It was an army built not on infantry charges, but on overwhelming firepower. He was creating a force that could demolish the Janissary barracks from a distance, a force that could turn their greatest strength, their concentration in the capital, into their greatest vulnerability. Every cannon cast, every officer trained, was another nail in the coffin of the old order. He was sharpening a blade in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In 1821, a fire was lit in the Peloponnese, a flame of revolution that would engulf the Ottoman Empire's western frontier. The Greek War of Independence was more than a provincial rebellion. It was a mirror held up to the decaying heart of Mahmud's military. He dispatched the Janissaries, the supposed elite, to extinguish the blaze. Instead, they poured fuel upon it. Their campaigns were a litany of failures, marked by indiscipline, incompetence, and a savage brutality that horrified Europe. Where tactical skill was needed, they offered only plunder and massacre. This wasn't the disciplined fighting force of legend. It was a degenerate mob, more adept at terrorizing civilians than defeating a determined insurgency. The great powers of Europe, stirred by romantic ideals of classical Greece, watched in disgust. The Philhellenic movement grew, and the Ottomans were cast as barbarian tyrants. The crisis deepened, and Mahmud II faced a profound humiliation. His own elite corps could not pacify a single province. He was forced to turn to his most powerful and ambitious vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt. The Khedive's modern, French-trained army, led by his son Ibrahim Pasha, arrived and did what the Janissaries could not. They were disciplined, effective, and ruthless. They won battles, retook cities, and nearly crushed the rebellion. For Mahmud, this success was a bitter poison. It proved beyond any doubt that a modern army was superior. It also demonstrated that his most powerful subject possessed a better military than he did. The Greek war was a distant warning, a signal flare in the night. It illuminated a terrible truth for the Sultan. The Janissaries were not just an obstacle to reform. They were a guarantee of the empire's dissolution. While his vassals' modern troops fought for him in Greece, the Sultan was solidifying a dark resolve in Istanbul. The Janissaries had failed their final test. The ghost of his cousin, Selim III, haunted Mahmud's every waking moment. Selim had been bold, visionary, and public with his reforms, and for that, the Janissaries had murdered him. Mahmud knew he could not repeat that mistake. His own counterstroke had to be forged in shadow, a conspiracy of the state against its own soldiers. Following the debacle in Greece, the Sultan crossed a psychological Rubicon. The question was no longer if he should destroy the Janissaries, but how. He began to move his pieces across the treacherous chessboard of Istanbul. His first and most crucial alliance was with the senior ulama, the religious establishment. He spent years cultivating their support, framing the Janissaries not as a traditional core, but as a corrupt, impious force that defied the will of God and the Caliph. He argued that their backwardness was a sin against the survival of the faith itself. He needed a fatwa, a religious decree, that would sanctify their destruction. Simultaneously, he courted the loyalty of the Imperial Artillery Corps, the Topsula. These were the men who understood modern warfare, who worked with cannon and mathematics. They held a deep professional contempt for the Janissaries' archaic methods and had often clashed with them in the streets. Mahmud armed them, promoted their officers, and made them his Praetorian Guard in waiting. Within the Divan, the Imperial Council, he identified loyal ministers and ruthless agents, men who understood that this was a zero-sum game. Failure meant not just political ruin, but a bloody end for them all. This was the long, patient terror of preparation. Every secret meeting, every quiet promise of power, every bag of gold exchanged was a step towards the precipice. For Mahmud, there was no turning back. He was weaving a web from which only one party would emerge alive. By the spring of 1826, Mahmud felt the web was complete. His allies were in place, the artillerymen were loyal, and the religious justification was prepared. All he needed was a pretext, a final provocation that would lure the beast out of its lair. On May 29th, he issued the decree. It announced the formation of a new infantry corps, the Eshkinchi, meaning active soldiers. They were to be selected from the younger Janissaries, trained in European drill and equipped with modern muskets. On the surface, it was presented as a modernization of the corps, not a replacement for it. But no one was fooled. This was Selim III's Nizam-i all over again, a dagger aimed at the very heart of Janissary power and identity. It was the ultimate insult. For centuries, they had been the foundation of Ottoman military might. Their drills, their traditions, their very sense of self were sacrosanct. Now, this Sultan was telling them their ways were obsolete. He was asking them to abandon the legacy of their forefathers and march like the infidel soldiers they so despised. The news hit the barracks and coffee houses of Istanbul like a spark in a powder magazine. The simmering resentment of years boiled over into open fury. The Janissary commanders saw their privileges, their corrupt business empires, and their political power evaporating before their eyes. The rank and file saw it as a betrayal of their martial honor. They began to conspire, just as they had always done. They spoke of deposing Mahmud, of placing a more pliable puppet on the throne. They were confident, arrogant. They had toppled sultans before. They believed this would be no different. They began sharpening their yataghan swords and hoarding ammunition, preparing to overturn their great bronze cauldrons, the ancient signal for rebellion. They were walking, step by predictable step, directly into the trap Mahmud had so meticulously prepared for them. On the night of June 14th, the point of no return was reached. The Janissaries, their rage finally boiling over, marched out of their barracks. They overturned their cauldrons in the At-Maidana, the ancient hippodrome, and declared their rebellion. Their target, as always, was the Topkapi Palace. They expected the Sultan to panic, to negotiate, or to flee. They expected history to repeat itself. But Mahmud II was not Selim III. He did not waver. This was the moment he had spent his entire reign preparing for. As the Janissary mobs began to riot, Mahmud executed a move of political and religious genius. He left his residence and proceeded to the Topkapi Palace, not to hide, but to seize the ultimate symbol of his authority. He ordered the keepers of the sacred relics to bring forth the Sankaka Sharif, the sacred standard of the Prophet Muhammad himself. This was no mere flag. It was one of the most revered objects in the entire Islamic world, the banner under which the Prophet had fought. To raise it was to issue a general call to arms to all faithful Muslims, to summon them to a holy war. As dawn broke over the Golden Horn on June 15th, the standard was unfurled from the palace gates. Imams climbed the minarets of Istanbul's great mosques, not for the regular call to prayer, but for a summons to jihad against the rebels. The message was clear and devastating. The Janissaries were not just rebels against the Sultan, they were traitors to the Prophet and enemies of Islam. The effect was electric. From every corner of the city, the people responded. Religious students, loyal soldiers, artillerymen, and ordinary citizens armed with knives and clubs poured into the streets, rallying to the sacred standard. Mahmud had masterfully transformed a military insurrection into a popular crusade. The Janissaries suddenly found themselves utterly alone, no longer the arbiters of power, but branded as heretics, surrounded by the fury of a city that had finally turned against them. It began, as it always did, with the cauldrons. On June 15th, 1826, the great bronze cauldrons of the Janissary corps were hauled into the centre of the hippodrome, the ancient heart of Constantinople, and overturned. This was not a mere gesture. It was a declaration of war, a ritual of rebellion honed over 4 centuries. To upturn the cauldron was to refuse the Sultan's soup, to refuse his authority, his very legitimacy. A low murmur rippled through the assembled thousands, a sound of simmering rage and arrogant confidence. They were the kingmakers, the Janissaries, the slave soldiers who had become the masters of the palace. They had deposed sultans, murdered viziers, and held the empire hostage to their whims. This new sultan, Mahmud II, with his Western-style army and his talk of reform, was just another obstacle to be swept aside. They believed they were untouchable. As they began their march towards the Topkapi Palace, their chants echoing through the narrow streets, the city's inhabitants bolted their doors. They knew the pattern: looting, violence, and the eventual capitulation of the Sultan. But inside the palace, Mahmud was not trembling. He was waiting. For years, he had meticulously planned for this very moment, nurturing a loyal, modern artillery corps in secret, securing the allegiance of the religious authorities, and gauging the public's exhaustion with Janissary tyranny. He had laid a trap, baiting it with his new army, the Eshkinchi. The Janissaries, blinded by their own power, had walked right into it. As the roar of the rebels grew louder at the palace gates, Mahmud did not send a negotiator. He listened, his face a mask of cold resolve. The cauldron had been overturned. The challenge had been made. But this time, the response would not be a concession. It would be an annihilation. Mahmud II did not meet the Janissary roar with a plea, but with a profound and sacred silence. From the highest ramparts of the Topkapi Palace, a sight unseen for generations, he ordered the unfurling of the Sankaka Sharif, the sacred standard of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The sacred green banner, believed to contain the prophet's own mantle, was a symbol of ultimate religious and political authority. It was not merely a flag, it was a summons, a call to every true believer to rise and defend the caliphate against its enemies from within. The city's imams echoed the call from their minarets, their voices soaring over the rebel chants, framing the Janissary revolt not as a political dispute, but as a sacrilegious betrayal. This was Mahmud's genius. He transformed a power struggle into a holy war. Suddenly, the Janissaries were no longer the people's champions. They were heretics. Citizens, long terrorized by the Corps, poured into the streets, armed with whatever they could find, rallying to their sultan. But Mahmud's true trump card was not the mob. It was the Topsus, his new artillerymen. Trained in secret, loyal to him alone, they wheeled their modern European cannons into position, their bronze barrels gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Janissaries, massed in the hippodrome, looked on with a mixture of confusion and contempt. Cannons against them, in the heart of the city. It was unthinkable. They were still expecting a parley, a list of demands, the head of a vizier on a platter. They were not prepared for the thunderous crack that split the air. The first cannonball screamed across the square, tearing a bloody path through their dense ranks. A moment of stunned silence followed, then a collective cry of disbelief and agony. The Sultan's cannons had spoken, and their language was not negotiation. It was extermination. Panic shattered the Janissary ranks. The disciplined corps that had terrified Europe for centuries dissolved into a panicked mob under the relentless artillery barrage. The hippodrome, their stage of power, became their abattoir. Grapeshot and cannonballs ripped through flesh and bone, turning their proud rebellion into a desperate scramble for survival. The survivors, routed and demoralized, did what they had always done. They fled to the perceived safety of their barracks, the sprawling wooden complexes that were their fortresses and homes. In any previous revolt, this would have been the end of the confrontation, a retreat to a stronghold from which to negotiate terms. But Mahmud II was not finished. He had no intention of negotiating. He pursued them. He ordered his Topsus to haul their cannons through the streets and aim them directly at the barracks. The command was simple and utterly ruthless. Leave nothing standing. The bombardment began anew, but this time it was more terrifying. The cannonballs smashed through the wooden walls, splintering beams and crushing those within. Then came the fire. The barracks, ancient and tinder-dry, erupted in flame. The night sky over Constantinople turned a hellish orange, illuminated by the funeral pyre of an entire institution. Screams echoed from within the inferno as men were burned alive. Those who managed to break out from the flames were met by the cold steel of Mahmud's loyal troops and the fury of the armed citizenry, who showed no mercy. There was no quarter given, no prisoners taken. For centuries, the Janissaries had been the fire that consumed others. Now they were consumed by it. The blaze raged through the night, a monstrous cleansing fire that eradicated not just thousands of men, but an entire epoch of Ottoman history. It was a surgical strike of unimaginable brutality, a night when a sultan decided that to save his empire, he first had to set a part of it on fire. The dawn of June 16th broke over a city transformed. A thick, acrid smoke hung in the air, a shroud over Constantinople that smelled of burnt wood and death. The first rays of sun illuminated a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The hippodrome was a grotesque carpet of bodies. The once bustling Janissary quarters were a blackened, smouldering wasteland, where charred timbers jutted into the sky like broken bones. But the most profound change was the silence. For the first time in centuries, the city was not filled with the swaggering presence, the boisterous shouts, and the clatter of weapons of the Janissaries. Their absence was a palpable void, an eerie quiet that was more powerful than any sound. Mahmud II had won a total, absolute victory. He had not just defeated a rebellion, he had excised a tumor that had been growing at the heart of his empire for generations. In a single bloody night, he had broken the chains that had bound his predecessors. He was now, truly, the master of his own destiny. That very day, a royal decree was read from every mosque. The Janissary Corps was formally and permanently abolished. Its name was cursed, its standards destroyed, its memory condemned. The event was officially named the Vaka-i Hayriya, the auspicious incident. The name was a masterpiece of political propaganda, recasting a brutal massacre as a blessed deliverance. The path to reform, to creating a modern, centralized state capable of surviving the 19th century, was now brutally and irrevocably cleared. But as Mahmud stood looking over his silent, scarred city, he must have understood the terrible price of this new dawn. He had built his future on a foundation of ash and bone. The empire was his to command, but it was an empire that would forever bear the memory of the night its sultan turned his cannons upon his own soldiers and burned them from history. The fires in Istanbul had been quenched, but the stench of rebellion and retribution still hung heavy in the air. From the ashes of the Janissary Corps, Mahmud II did not simply rebuild. He birthed something entirely new. He named it the Asakir-i Mansura-i Muhammadiyya, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. The name was a masterstroke of political genius. It was not the new order of his murdered cousin Selim III, a name that reeked of European influence and infidelity. This was an army of the Prophet, a holy force for a renewed Islamic empire. It was a declaration that this was not a westernization, but a purification. Yet beneath the sacred banner, the structure was ruthlessly modern. European advisors, once forced to operate in the shadows, were now openly courted. Prussian officers drilled Ottoman peasants in the art of the bayonet charge. French engineers taught the principles of modern artillery. The new soldiers were conscripted, paid a regular salary, and housed in new, disciplined barracks. They wore European-style uniforms, their heads shaved, their faces clean. This was more than a military reform. It was a social re-engineering. The old Janissary identity, a chaotic blend of warrior guild, social club, and political mob, was eradicated. In its place rose the professional soldier, loyal not to his corps or his but to the Sultan alone. Mahmud oversaw the process with an obsessive eye. He attended drills, inspected weaponry, and promoted officers based on merit, not connection. He was forging not just an army, but the very instrument of his will, the steel spine of a state he intended to remake from the ground up. The challenges were immense. Centuries of military tradition could not be unlearned in a day. But for the first time in over 100 years, the sound of marching in Istanbul was the sound of order, not of impending revolt. It was the sound of the Sultan's absolute authority finally, and bloodily, restored. With his new army securing his throne, Mahmud II unleashed a torrent of reforms that struck at the very heart of Ottoman identity. His revolution was not confined to the barracks. It marched into the ministries, the schools, and onto the very heads of his subjects. The most visible and perhaps most controversial symbol of this new era was the fez. By a royal decree, or firman, the turban, a complex and ancient signifier of rank, religion, and social standing, was outlawed for all government officials and soldiers. In its place was the simple, crimson, brimless fez. This was a radical act of egalitarianism and centralization. Where the turban had highlighted a man's place in a fractured hierarchy, the fez declared him simply an Ottoman, a servant of the state. It was an attempt to erase old loyalties and forge a new, unified citizenship. But the changes went far deeper. The labyrinthine mess of the imperial divan was dismantled. In its place, Mahmud established European-style ministries. Ministries of the interior, of foreign affairs, of finance. A cabinet of ministers, the Meclisi Vukala, now advised the Sultan, bringing a semblance of rational, bureaucratic order to the administration of a vast empire. He founded the empire's first official newspaper, the Takvim-i Vaka-i, a tool for disseminating government decrees and shaping a public narrative. A modern postal service was established, shrinking the vast distances of the empire and tightening the grip of the central government. Medical schools and military academies were opened, teaching Western science and languages. Each reform was a chisel, chipping away at the ancient edifice of the Ottoman world. To conservatives, this was a terrifying betrayal of tradition, an embrace of the very infidel ways they had fought for centuries. But to Mahmud, it was a desperate battle for survival. He was not merely dressing his empire in Western clothes. He was performing life-saving surgery, cutting out the diseased organs of the old world to give the empire a fighting chance in the new. Mahmud had purged the rot from within, but the wolves were circling without. The destruction of the Janissaries, while necessary, had left the empire militarily vulnerable at the worst possible moment. In 1828, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, seeing an opportunity in the Ottoman chaos, declared war. It was the ultimate test for the fledgling, victorious soldiers of Muhammad, and they were not ready. The new army was enthusiastic and disciplined, but it was green. It lacked experienced officers, a seasoned non-commissioned officer corps, and the deep institutional knowledge that wins campaigns. They fought with a desperate bravery, but they were no match for the seasoned, methodical Russian war machine. The war was a catalogue of disasters. The Russians stormed through the Balkans, a region already seething with nationalist rebellion. The great fortress of Varna fell. On the Caucasian front, Kars and Erzurum were lost. Mahmud's new army, the pride of his reign and the fruit of his bloody purge, was broken and pushed back relentlessly. The humiliation was absolute. By the summer of 1829, the Russian army stood at Adrianople, a mere 100 miles from the domes and minarets of Istanbul itself. The capital was in a panic. For the first time since its conquest, the heart of the empire felt the very real threat of Christian conquest. Mahmud was forced to accept the humiliating Treaty of Adrianople. It recognized the independence of Greece, a devastating blow to imperial prestige. It granted autonomy to Serbia and the Danubian principalities, effectively making them Russian protectorates. The empire lost territory, paid a massive indemnity, and granted Russia sweeping commercial and political rights. For Mahmud, it was a lesson written in blood and territory. Destroying the old was one thing, but building a new power capable of defending the realm was a far longer, more arduous journey. The Janissaries were gone, but the Russian bear was now at the gate. Mahmud II died in 1839, worn down by tuberculosis, alcohol, and the colossal strain of his 31-year reign. He left behind an empire that was battered, diminished, yet fundamentally transformed. He was a figure of profound contradictions, a modernizer who ruled as an absolute autocrat, a destroyer who sought to build, a sultan who saved the sultanate by eviscerating its traditions. He was, in many ways, a deeply lonely figure. He had annihilated the old elites, but the new ones he fostered were not yet fully formed. He stood astride two worlds, belonging fully to neither. His methods were brutal, his purges merciless. The massacre of the Janissaries, the suppression of local warlords, the centralization of power, all were achieved at a staggering human cost. Yet, without these brutal acts, the Ottoman Empire would almost certainly have disintegrated completely in the early 19th century. He arrested the decay, reset the foundation, and cleared the ground for what was to come. His sons and successors would build upon his work in the Great Reform era, known as the Tanzimat, which would have been unthinkable without Mahmud's violent prelude. The bureaucracy he created, the military he forged, and the secular-minded elite he began to cultivate would ultimately manage the empire's long, slow decline and, in its final collapse, provide the very framework for the Turkish Republic. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, would later complete Mahmud's revolution, but with a secular fury the Sultan could never have imagined. Mahmud II was not the savior of the Ottoman Empire. He was its great, tragic, and necessary reformer. He was Peter the Great of the Bosphorus, a man who dragged his people, kicking and screaming, into a new century. He was the lonely father of a future he would never see, an architect whose brutal, bloody groundwork made modern Turkey possible.